First Christian Church. This is your midweek message, and today we got a question through our Dropbox, in which case we decided to answer. We didn't have to, but we decided to out of the kindness of our hearts. And so if you would like to put down a message for this Sunday, or this upcoming Sunday, there will be forms on our Dropbox, which will be in the back of the auditorium, and you can fill those out and then just put them in the box. And then we might review your questions later.
So each week we're going to be talking about some of the things that I didn't get to cover during the message, or potentially questions, and we did get a question. Before we get there, one of the things that I didn't get to talk about a whole lot, I talked about how hard it would have been to take the message to the Samaritans, for the Jewish people, in Acts chapter 8 specifically, and the history that went between the two people groups would have been very difficult to present the gospel to, because there was a lot of love lost basically between these groups. You may recall one of the phrases that people would have said from the Jews to the Samaritans, they would have potentially called them half-breed heretics. That's not a great term to call somebody. And so I talked about how difficult it would have been for people to take the message to someone that they didn't like, take the greatest news ever to someone that they potentially didn't care for or love or have compassion or empathy or anything towards, and how difficult it actually would have been to go in a loving manner to share something that's very important. But one of the things that I didn't talk about was how hard it would be to receive a message from somebody that you also had that kind of tension with. And I know that it's true that for me anyway, when somebody has confronted me with something, even if it's true, if they're the wrong person or they've said it the wrong way, it's hard for me to hear it. And so one of the beautiful things about the people in Samaria to be able to receive the message of Christ as they do in Acts chapter 8, as Philip is going and that whole story with Simon the magician is happening, is that the people are now at a place where they're able to receive the message as well. And that means that it's a significant time, because, again, right person, right time, right place. All of those things matter. If one of those things is off, it could derail the entire message. The way that it's communicated, the way that it's received, anything like that. So it's amazing that this is able to happen. And so receiving a message is just as hard sometimes as giving a message. Now, one of the other things that came up throughout that was that the last time that Peter and John specifically would have come through this area, we had talked about, was in Luke chapter 9. And that happened in, I believe, verses 51 through 56, in which case James and John asked Jesus, hey, these people are refusing us. They're not giving us a place to stay. Would it be all right if we call down fire from heaven against these people? In which case Jesus rebukes them. Now, I think that it's out of that particular story on Sunday that this next question comes out, because one of the things that I had mentioned was that it's not okay for us to be violent with people, even when they disagree with us, when they don't accept us, when they don't welcome us. And so this question was asked this week, and so I'm going to ask Brian and Jeffrey to also respond into it a little bit, and then I'll talk about it a little as well. But this question comes up. What happens if I'm being persecuted and someone comes for my family? Am I to accept it or fight back? Should I fight back? And so what do you guys think? That's a pretty good question. It's loaded. It's big. What do you think?
So I've always been told if someone's fighting you, you should fight back.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, technically it's not illegal because it's in self-defense wise,
Mm-hmm.
but then also you're supposed to care about one another in a sense, which makes it a difficult question alone in a sense. So that would be pretty difficult to answer, in my opinion.
Well, and part of the problem is there's a lot of ambiguity within what we're talking about, because if somebody's persecuting you, well, that could mean a lot of things. Does that mean somebody's coming into your house? Does that mean that somebody's approaching you on the street? Is it a situation in which, I mean, is it Nazi Germany where it's legal for them to grab you? And so some of these dynamics might seem like splitting hairs, but how you're going to respond is going to be largely contextual. But the issue of whether violence is sanctioned by Jesus or not is, I mean, it's huge. It's something the church has wrestled with pretty much since Jesus. Early Christians, like the first Christians, you know, wouldn't even serve in the military because of that. Whereas, obviously, we have a much different view of that now. And so it's a very complex question, and we've done a great job of not answering anything so far.
That's fair. So I obviously have some opinions in this as well, but I think one of the things that gets really important is, like, probably Brian, you have some opinions, Jeffrey, you have some opinions. I obviously have some opinions as well, but let's think about Jesus specifically, and not to get too cliche with that, what would Jesus do, but what did Jesus say? Because it's one thing that, you know, if Les says it, or if Brian says it, or if Jeffrey says it, but so I'm just thinking out loud a little bit here. What do we know that Jesus said about what we're to do with our enemies? And so, because this question actually lends to that, at least, that we're going to have an enemy. And so what does Jesus say about how we're to treat our enemies?
Right, in which case would also say, love your enemies as yourself. Another good way of portraying that would be the movie, not sponsored because but is the movie Hacksaw Ridge. Because in that movie, spoiler alert, is that the main character does not necessarily say no about going to the military, but also decides to help everyone in the process.
He finds a way to serve.
Right. And so in which case he's not killing anyone.
But he's very brave.
Right. Especially since his team completely forgot about him and he's up there on the Hacksaw Ridge. And in which case he starts saving people's lives and bring them down below to help them.
And he is a hero.
Right.
In that real life story. That's true. What else do we know? Brian, what do you think? What does Jesus say about how we're to treat our enemies?
Well, a lot of what Jesus says directly in this issue is found on the Sermon on the Mount. So you know, if we're looking at Matthew 5-7, we're going to see stuff there. And the thing that's tricky about what Jesus has to say in those passages is that everything is single person related. It's all about what you should do for your enemy and what you should do when you're confronted. He doesn't really say anything about what you should do when somebody else is being injured or somebody else is being persecuted, and when it's your responsibility to act and protect them. Like, how are you loving them when you're not? And so I think he's pretty clear that when the persecution is coming against you, I mean, you have a calling to find a way to be loving and to be almost surprising. The example that always comes to mind, as hard as it is the Jim Elliot and the missionaries who were attacked by the Aucas. They had guns. They didn't use them. And that's wound up being one of the things that transformed the entire tribe. And so there's definitely a responsibility there. But when that goes away from you and all of a sudden the issue isn't just yourself but protecting somebody else, I think that is quite possibly a different issue, but that's also putting words in Jesus' mouth.
That's right.
Which I don't really want to do.
No, that's fair. You know, some catch verses I think that we would be able to grab into in this context is like, we definitely know we should pray for our enemies. Do we consider that enough? I don't know that we do. You know, how often do we think about, man, if they come against me, I'm going to do this, but how often have we actually incited the power of God on behalf of them to change? And so praying for our enemies is there. We know that Jesus said to turn the other cheek. We also know that for himself, when he had the opportunity to call legions of angels to his aid, instead of doing that, even when he's being arrested, Peter tries to take up arms to protect him from being arrested. And Jesus rebukes him and says, those who live by the sword will also die by the sword. And instead of saying, hey, Peter, thanks for doing what you were trying to do, he rebuked him, and then he heals the soldier. he puts the ear back on the Roman soldier's side of his face. And it's just like, man. So those are some instances that we see. Now, granted, we see that there's a bigger narrative happening there. Jesus knows that he's going to the cross to die on behalf of the world. And so I think that lends into this conversation also. If Jesus is considering eternity more important than anything else, then I think that's something we probably should consider more often, at least, is the eternity of other people. And so even our enemies, I know that I have faith in Christ, and so by extension, my belief is that there is life after this life. Brian, Jeffrey, I know that you guys also have that belief, and that you believe in eternal life, and that you have that not safety or fallback, but an actual belief that there is more after this. And so, like, when we think through the lens of eternity, how might that shape how we view, how we react to others in violence or nonviolence? What do you guys think?
Yeah. So I think in a way, since I'm not like super like I haven't read the entire Bible yet, and I don't know everything, unlike you guys, where both of you guys have gone to college for it. But so in a sense, the way I was taking that was, if I wouldn't say necessarily fight back then, like I said previously, where it should be more to a point where you try and understand the person to try and help them, instead of, oh, you're doing this to hurt me and that's your intention. It's more of a, you're in pain and you need help, so let me help you, type of thing is what I was thinking of.
So their need of eternity is more important than my immediate need of safety.
Right.
Okay.
Because I think in the end, it would be a better goal of saving someone from hurting multiple other people than just you. Because, I mean, in the end, doing that one thing might be able to help other people not get hurt by that person, as of where you just protected yourself. Yeah. Which, I mean, I'm not saying protecting yourself isn't bad. Most definitely protect yourself, but also do it in a sense of trying to help the person who is trying to do something, in a sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Brian?
I think that, I mean, obviously this issue has more relevance than we would like it to when we think about like shootings in churches and that sort of thing, and what do you protect this person? And it would be nice if this was completely irrelevant, and unfortunately it's not. But I also think that when we talk about this issue, we need to be aware that we encounter the concept of loving our enemies every day. And while most of us are probably not going to encounter a shooting situation today, we're all going to have enemies today. And if we're not aware of how we're going to approach our enemies in a Christ-like fashion, today when we encounter them at a football game or a baseball game, it doesn't really matter what we're going to do when there's a shooter. Our calling is to be loving in every situation, and that is often, I mean, we can make black and white rules about when there's a shooter, we're going to do this, but like, what are we going to do with the person that was just really hard to love?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because that brings it into the more relevant, like, not that the other's not relevant. Like you said, I mean, we do have shootings today, and, the what if scenario, while we all would dread it actually becoming a reality, we do have an everyday where we do have enemies, and I think that's real. Like, are we loving those that talk bad about us? Are we loving those that are gossiping about us? Those that make our life difficult at work, at school, any place? Are we praying for our enemies? Are we trying with our actions to love people, with our words encourage people? Are we trying to live a biblical life that proclaims Christ well? Or are we just trying to be better at being good the way the world sees it? So I think that's pretty relevant stuff. I know recently we talked in a meeting just about, like, what would we do if we came into that unforeseen circumstance? And so sometimes people like people to weigh in on this or not. Again, as you said, we don't have necessarily an instance where it's like, this is what you do individually. Yes, we have that, but what if it happens to someone else and what our role is in that? We also see in the Old Testament that there's a time for war. Well, what is that time? What is the time to take up arms? What is the time to fill in the blank? And so I think, just that same question that I was asking about eternity weighs into it for me, at least, is that let's say that we were to, God forbid, have an active shooter come into FCC Tuscola. We have one person coming in who most likely is outside of the grace of God if they're willing to act in such a way. And so they come in, and on a regular basis, we've got anywhere from 70 to 100 people in each of our services. And so that one person comes in, I guarantee you that not every single person of those 70 to 100 is eternally secure. And so this person, I think, potentially forfeits their rights because they're threatening the eternity of 3 to 15, 20 other people. And so if we're weighing eternity and putting that in the balance, is one person's eternity more significant than 20 people's eternity? And so if that's the case, then the loss of the one being taken out in defense would, in my mind, be justified because 20 eternities is more important than one eternity. That said, all eternity is important. And so we really need to take our role of sharing the gospel with people who are lost seriously. And so we look for opportunities to share the gospel, not just in actions, but also in word. I think that as we wrap up here, one of the last things that I'd share, I'm reminded of the quote from Chuck Swindoll. He says, the hardest thing for a Christian is not between what's good and bad. Those tend to be easier, but between what's better and best. And I think that's where we get into these discussions of what if and these scenarios. But if we prepare our minds and our hearts and our lives to choose what's best instead of what's acceptable or what's just kind of better than what somebody else would choose, then we're most likely going to honor Jesus because we're aiming high then. We're trying to be the best that he has called us to be. So, guys, thanks for your participation. One of the things we want to encourage you guys is you dial in and look this up on your website and stuff as you go to the FCC YouTube station. We want to encourage you that none of us have everything figured out. And so these discussions are going to expose that. We want to encourage you with the word. We want to encourage you with lively discussion. And one of the things I love about Jeffrey sitting with us too is even from his own admission, some of these things feel a little overwhelming because he doesn't feel quite as prepared. Guys, that's fair. And so one of the things that we can accept is then we get more prepared and we read the word and we engage in important conversations like these. And we just continue to grow in our relationship with Christ. So thank you for tuning in to the midweek message. We look forward to having more of these with you. So God bless you.
Bye.